Great. So thanks everyone for coming. We're very happy today to welcome Kartik Sheth. He's currently a program scientist in the astrophysics division at NASA. Before then, he spent his career in astrophysics. He first did his PhD at the University of Maryland, and then a postdoc at Caltech, was then staff at Caltech and staff at a number of radio observatories. From 2021 to 2022, he served as the Assistant Director for Research Infrastructures and Science Equity at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Well, it's nice to be here. Thank you for the invitation. You all can still hear me online, right? Yes, great. So I after talking to Patrick, I kind of divided the talk into three parts. He said, based on what all of you have already heard, it would be useful for me to give you some concrete examples of how policy is made. And he said, maybe talk a little bit about, you haven't heard what happens inside the White House. So I think I'll try to give you a look at as to what happens inside the White House in the first third of the talk. The second third of the talk, I'll kind of take you through a couple of examples of policymaking right now at the White House level and also at NASA. And then the last half of my talk is really career path, which I hope will be useful for you. It's very hard to figure out whether you want to call me an astrophysicist or not, as you will see. I feel like I've had way too many careers, but as I was saying to Mary, I'm ready to leave and go do something else now. So I don't know what that means. Okay, so good lag here. I really am just honored to be here. And roughly speaking, I just want you to remember this point, because whether you go into policy or not, where you come from and kind of what you do at each step of the way in your career is really going to define how you react to things and what kind of policies you make or what kind of decisions you make as a leader. So it's always really, really important, I think, for people to reflect on where you come from. And so for me, my biggest influences are probably growing up in India, going to Grinnell College, and then kind of my academic path. And I'll come back to that in a second. So this, I showed you kind of the educational institutions that define you, but really for most people, it's the people that they are with that define you, right? So it's your friends, your family, your coworkers. And so I also want you to think about that as you think about what next steps in your career as you go on to be an academic leader or a policy leader. And for me, another thing that really has influenced me is really being an astronomer and traveling the world. And so I feel like I have a very good global perspective on when I approach problems. So like just this weekend and today we've been working on a situation in South Africa, which you can ask me in Q&A. I just realized how helpful it was for being able to spend time in South Africa that influenced my ability to help NASA make the right decisions in this regard. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about Office of Science and Technology Policy, and I'm happy to share the links that are in these slides with you if you would like. So the top part is linked. The Office of Science and Technology Policy was established in 1976 to serve as a source of scientific and technological analysis and judgment for the President of the United States with respect to major policies, plans, and programs of the federal government. When I was a graduate student and I really was interested in doing policy work, and I was at University of Maryland, I always thought, boy, it's going to be such a dream job to be able to work at Office of Science and Technology Policy. I never ever thought I would have ever worked there. So I'm really glad that I was able to get this chance. The figure here shows you how the office is currently organized, which is very different than the traditional organization. In the past, this office only had 3 branches. It had Science and Technology, it had the Office of Chief Technology, and National Security. In this administration, we have really created 6 core teams, which are in these 6 areas. So we have a climate and environment team, an energy team, a health and life sciences team, national security, science and society, and US CTO. We have not hired a US CTO, and I can talk to you about what's happening in each of these, but if you go to the GAO report, it lists what these different offices have said that they are doing. And you can kind of see the number of FTE stands for full-time effort. It's the number of people who are in the Office of Science and Technology Policy. So, there were very few during the previous administration, during the Trump administration. But as I was saying to the folks at lunch, I have nothing but the highest admiration for those people who served during the previous administration, because one, there were so few, and they were just dedicated public servants. I overlapped with them, and they did their best to keep science and technology going. So I really, really admire them quite a bit. This administration, we have a lot of people in there. And then, it's sort of now capped out. So one question you might think about is, how do you get to the Office of Science and Technology Policy? How can you be in a place where you can influence decisions at a national or international level when it comes to doing science? So I hope this doesn't make you a cynic, like I'm a little bit of a cynic after having worked at the White House. But the left-hand side here talks about, what I did the first 2 or 3 months, and which I think was extremely helpful to me in the long run. I just did coffees with every single person I could meet. I was like, let's just go do a 15, 20 minute, let me just get to know you. How did you get here? What are you doing? Because I realized that what I want to build coalitions. And what I found out is that most people who got there had either worked in the previous Obama-Biden administration. About half the people I would say were just repeat people who were coming back. They were connected to somebody who was appointed. So, a lot of academics were appointed in this administration. So their postdocs and their graduate students often came with them. If you played a role in the transition team, so every time a new administration comes in, and how the transition teams are set up, I don't know. Still a mystery to me. But many people were part of the transition team, and then they just used that as a stepping stone. If you worked on the campaign, a lot of people, even in the Office of Science and Technology Policy, were people who didn't have a science or technology background, but they worked on the campaign, and this was a place that they could have a basically payback for the hard work they did on the campaign. And then serving on the NSTC interagency team. NSTC stands for National Science and Technology Council. So I'll show you a figure. This is a body that has been set up for many years, and it involves a lot of interagency groups that are set up. And so if you work on those, then there's a likelihood that you know enough people that you are able to try to find your way into OSTP. The interesting part about these teams is, when I was at NASA headquarters, you never know who's serving on what or how they're selected. So it's very much who gets tapped on their shoulder, right? So if I was talking to a government audience, or if you all go into government work, you're going to have to work hard to figure out who's on an NSTC team and how can you join it. Part of the reason for that obfuscation is intentional, is because here these people are talking really, really directly to the White House on these teams. And so agencies are a little skittish about talking too openly about it or committing themselves too much. And the White House also always says, please send us somebody who's in a decision-making capacity to be part of these teams. So it's kind of so there isn't always a lot of diversity on these teams, for example, given the way the government is set up right now, but it's changing. Okay, so I was very naive, and I really was depressed at the end of the Trump administration, and I was talking to my wife, and I said, we got to get out. We got to get out of this country. She's like, you can't leave till you've given it your all, right? So I was like, all right. And when the new administration was coming in, I was like, well, the priorities of this administration, which were fourfold, really resonate with what I'm interested in, right? The climate, economic advancement, equity, and pandemic preparedness. The last one is not in my wheelhouse, but the first three were. So I said, okay, well, there's a website that they set up, Build Back Better. What about, so I found out by talking to people who was on the transition team, and they gave me a little code, which was supposed to move your resume up of the hundreds of thousands of resumes they got from the Build Back Better site. But honestly, to this day, I have never met a single person who was hired through that website. But the good thing about applying there was the fact that it forced me to, one, write a 2-page resume, which was very helpful. And it forced me to really think about what would I do if I went. And so that helped me really then do the next step, which somebody told me, raise your hand every chance you get. Everybody you meet, you should tell them you want to serve in the White House. So that's what that little figure up there is meant to show. And networking is basically how I ended up there. So through a couple of connections, Alondra Nelson, who used to be here as the Dean for Social Sciences, she offered me a position after interviews to be the Assistant Director for Physical Sciences. And Jane Lubchenko offered me a position on her Climate and Environment team to be the Assistant Director for Earth Observations, Environmental and Racial Justice. And it was very difficult to choose between the two. And Keiko Izumi, who was then the Chief of Staff, he said, Kartik, I don't need to ask you questions. Like, what do you want to do? And I said, well, I kind of want to do both of those things. And he said, okay, well, then we just ended up with this description for what I would do at the White House that you could drive a truck through. Basically, it gave me kind of carte blanche to, I felt like, do a lot of different things. The key things I've just put are the ones that I highlighted there. They really wanted me to lead efforts to generate policy that took a comprehensive, holistic approach to scientific and research infrastructures, including their capacity to inspire STEM, anchor communities, foster economic opportunity, advance equity, and drive unparalleled research and development. So it's a tall task because you're now told you're responsible for much of the nation's research and development infrastructure and do whatever you can to make sure we stay at the bleeding edge while incorporating all of the administration priorities, right? So there's no lack of work you can do, but you kind of have to be very thoughtful about what you want to take on in doing this. You are also given assignments. So because of these NSTC body, which I'll show you on the next slide, I was the chair of 3 committees. The Physical Sciences Subcommittee, which all of you probably are most interested in, deals with physical sciences. The Subcommittee on Advanced Manufacturing, which I knew nothing about. I knew nothing about manufacturing, but I would say it's the best work I did because I ended up building a coalition of all the people interested in manufacturing and supply chain, from kind of the people working on lab to market, to advanced manufacturing, to regular manufacturing, to supply chain, and building a coalition across OSTP, and then the National Economic Council, the Council of Economic Advisors, OMB. And I think together, many of the problems that you probably thought about at the beginning of COVID were things that we had to deal with. So I have a very funny story. I go downstairs to meet Liz Reynolds, she's a SAP, she's a special assistant to the president in charge of manufacturing. Oh, she's in charge of supply chains. So I say, hey, Liz, are we going for coffee? And she's like, I can't talk to you right now. I have to get these fish sticks out of the port. I'm like, what are you talking about? So it turned out that 3 months of fish sticks that supplied all of the Northeast were stuck in a port in Canada because the ship that brought them in flew on a flag carrier that we didn't want to work with. So I met her at 3 o'clock. She'd solved the issue. We went and got a coffee at the West Wing, which I wasn't badged for the West Wing, but she was because she was a SAP. So it was nice to be able to go in and get a coffee. But like things like that, right? Like many offices are really solving day-to-day problems. You know, you hear about the problem on the news and you have to try to solve it that day. So it's kind of exciting. It's a lot of fun. This next slide shows you the entire National Science and Technology Council. This is probably already out of date. This is what it was at the beginning of the Biden administration. And then the yellows are my committees that I led, including scientific collections, and then also the International Science and Technology. But you can see basically what these committees do is they bring together different parts of the executive branch. So no non-government people are on these committees usually. It's only government people and really coming together to try to really solve pressing problems. The White House is typically in the lead in the sense that as the chair of the Subcommittee on Advanced Manufacturing, I helped design the strategy for advanced manufacturing for the next 4 years. It's congressionally required, and we had to come together and write that report. And then that influences how each agency will execute that. So we're right now in the stage where we're writing an implementation plan for each of the things that are in the strategic plan. And then we connect that to the budget so we can get the money to execute that. In the Physical Sciences Subcommittee, I got handed a report I had to finish called Low-Dose Radiation Biology, the response to American Innovation and Competition Act. I haven't taken biology since 8th grade. And I had to learn about low dose radiation biology. And not only that, I had to present that in front of the National Academies of Sciences. So, it was really fun. As I was saying before, every day at the White House was like first day of graduate school. You show up, somebody comes in, gives you a problem, you know nothing about it. By noon, you got to learn enough, and you have to be very quick about being able to understand all of the parameters of that problem and start devising policy. And so very, very fast paced. Now, the executive branch of the president, EOP, has many components. Office of Science and Technology Policy is only one, but my work overlapped with the National Economic Council, the Council of Economic Advisors, the National Security Council, the National Space Council, the Domestic Policy Council, the Council on Economic Environmental Quality, Office of Management and Budget, and the White House office, which everything that didn't fall in fell into the White House office. And then from across the USD, which stands for US government, and you can see this alphabet soup of agencies that you worked with. My main takeaway here is you have to learn to build coalitions. But the nice thing about having a White House business card is if you call somebody, they will pick up the phone. When I went to NASA after a career in academia, people told me, oh, people always pick up the phone because they see the NASA. It's not true. Nobody picks it. They're like, oh, you're probably calling me to serve on a panel or a committee, you know, and they don't. But from the White House, they always picked up the phone. This building right here that you see on the bottom is the Eisenhower Old Executive Office Building. It's at 17th and Pennsylvania. It's right across from the Renwick Gallery. It is one of the most beautiful buildings in DC. So if you ever get invited by anybody in the White House, definitely go and just set aside an hour to go visit the building itself, because it's just gorgeous. I'll show you some pictures from inside. And then right next to it is the White House. So everybody who works, about 1,000 people work in this old executive office building, and far fewer, a few hundred work in the East and the West Wing. The East Wing is where the First Lady's office is. The West Wing is where the president works. And then everybody else is in this building. So see if I remember this. I think National Space Council has now moved to the second floor. National Security Council is on the third floor. Office of Management and Budget is on the second floor. So all of these different components are on different floors. So this is not your typical job, as you already learned from what I'm saying to you. Being a generalist really helps. It's really key that whatever work you're doing has to align with what the president's priorities are. So you always have to keep that in mind. The job titles are made up. My job title was made up, right? They're completely fluid, but they're not meaningless, because it allows you to open doors with that title. And then portfolios within that can be very, very specific. Some people come there to do one thing, they want to do it and leave. And like me, I was one of the 3 physical scientists, right? And at the time. And so I was doing everything in physical sciences at the time. The day when onboarding and IT support wasn't that great, you know, to be honest, they wouldn't give us Macs. So it made it very difficult for me to learn how to use a PC. In fact, I think my cataracts got worse, and I got cataract surgery at the end because I was just training too hard. And they gave you iPhones, but you couldn't use text on it. So it was only to make a phone call. And you could use Zoom, but you can't text. You can't use text, even though the rest of the government used text on Zoom. So it was just very strange. Was there a reason for that? Why do you think use text? I think it's basically to do with just national security and people eavesdropping, but also the Government Records Act is much more strictly enforced in the White House, as opposed, it's true everywhere else. All of our communication is always tracked and stored, but you're very likely for somebody to FOIA it. FOIA stands for the Freedom of Information Act. So as you can see, you know, Tucker Carlson and all their texts coming out. So there's a good example of danger that can happen. So they try to minimize the exposure that you might expose the administration to. So as you know, in the Trump administration, and to some extent in this administration also, people kind of got around that because they use Signal. So that wasn't very good, but I won't say anything more about that. So org charts and directories were non-existent at the time. If you looked at the most recent GEO report, they've got better. COVID was really terrible, right? Because many people were even working remotely. We had people from Alaska, people from Georgia working. So that was difficult to work there. So the National Security Council people were my favorite people because they had to come in, because they have to go into SCIFs, which is the sensitive, compartmentalized intelligence facilities. I don't know what the I stands for, but they're always in SCIFs, so they have to be there. So I got to hang out with them a lot. Tom Khalil and Kumar Garg, who worked in the Obama administration for 8 years, were very generous, picked up the phone, gave me and gave lots of other people incredible advice. So that was super valuable. I would say, I don't know if the advice from many of the people who've never served in government, especially academics, was very helpful. It really wasn't. So most important, I would say, were the coffees that I mentioned and the human relations. So even today, I continue to do a lot of work there. The human relations is what greases the wheel for policymaking. So that's really key. Okay, so just some fun. This is my last day at the White House. So Chirag Parikh, who's the executive secretary for National Space Council, was walking me through this so we could like take pictures with the White House in the background. This is the old executive office building. So it looks like what's in Veep, but Veep has windows on the outside. The hallways don't have windows on the outside. This next picture shows you the West Exec. So you would always have this phalanx of SUVs idling with their motors running. It was really disgusting, to be honest, but you have cabinet ministers coming in, you have foreign ministers coming in. So in some ways, I felt like I was back in LA, like you're always sightseeing, like who's here today? So once I was walking and the Secret Service person's pointing to me, he's like, be careful. I'm like, what's happening? And the first lady was walking behind me. So they didn't want me to run into her. There was one time when we just stood by those stairs with just waiting because we knew the VP would walk by, because you don't see the VP and the president that often. We saw the president often on the 4th floor because the video room is on the 4th floor where the OSTP offices are. So you would often see him walk by. But you knew that the president and the vice president were in the building when you saw the people with machine guns inside the building. This is one of the most secure places, and you still had people with machine guns. It was a little unnerving. And this next picture I'm showing you is the only place, EOB, this little tiny spot with like 6 tables where you could meet. So oftentimes we just left the complex to go out and get a coffee at Pete's across the way or Starbucks. But there's a little cafeteria downstairs called Ike's. If you were in a real rush, you could go get coffee or something to eat there. But really, the food was better outside. The building in the back there that you see, I don't know if you can see the little brick-colored building behind the lamppost on the left. Those are also White House executive offices. This is the old executive building. On that side is the new executive office building, and the Office of Management and Budget and some of the other EOP components live there. And now they've made it one complex. So you can still walk in between them, but gee. All right, so now I'm gonna give you a very quick example of ongoing effort on how we make policy, especially at the intersection of science and diversity, equity, and inclusion, because that's what you asked me to talk about, right? And equity was in my title. I've been working on diversity, equity, inclusion for 30 years. And as I'll show you in my career path, like this is something that I just do automatically, but I don't want to be called a diversity, equity, inclusion consultant or a practitioner, because I really think this is the swimming pool we all live in. We have to all be doing this at all the times in order for us to really leverage the diversity of thought that's necessary for every study shows that's what leads to excellence. So we published a report called the National Strategic Overview, NSO for short, for Research and Development Infrastructure. My predecessor, Pat Looney, from the previous administration had started it. I finished it. And one of the key things is in this figure, we kind of talk about, it's a document you will read and you're like, there's nothing in here. And a lot of policy documents feel that way, right? Like they're very high level. You're like, I can't dig my teeth into that. And especially as you're a scientist, you're going to go, this is so boring. So I want to show you how you take that into doing something that's actionable. So within this, we put human capital as an important component of what we wanted to do. And we got a group together. This is our group that's showing up at the bottom. So myself, Roland Roberts, Mariam Al-Sayed, Rita Devine, Catalina Martinez, and Tina are part of this working group that works within the Research and Development Infrastructure Subcommittee. First thing we did was we started with our contractors, STIPI, to really look at their data. And whereas in 2015, a study had been done that showed there was significant impact, positive impact, between having a diverse team and better results. Newer results in the last 8 years have shown that, in fact, only increasing diversity has mixed results. So these are 3 examples where you can have positive results, no results, or negative results when the only thing you're focusing in on is a more diverse team. All the new data suggests that, and we did over 28 studies that we looked at, excellence of a team, the ability to innovate, the ability to do better than kind of the sum of the parts really depends on strong informal relationships and interactional integration. So that's like sociological study words. But basically what it means is that the most important quality is inclusion, right? Diversity is easy. You can count people. Inclusion is much, much harder. So that's what these studies are starting to show. We said, okay, well, how do we incorporate this at each step of a research and development infrastructure? A research and development infrastructure could be an observatory we build. It could be a lab that we're building. It could be a computer network. It could be anything that does research or technology development of any sort. And we said, well, how can we get the US government and all of the associated labs to incorporate the principles of inclusion, diversity, equity, accessibility in the work that they do? So to do that, our team decided we would use design thinking, and you will see this more than once in my talk. How many people here have heard of design thinking? Just one? Okay, 2. All right, so let me quickly say what design thinking is. Design thinking is a process that deliberately slows you down when you're trying to find a solution for human-centered problems. I'm in love with this process because as a scientist, it's a great tool for me to solve problems that involve human beings. And it's actually something that you all as scientists intuitively already know, right? We all as scientists are very good at identifying a problem. But then what do? Right? We're taught, make an hypothesis, right? We basically jump from the problem to a solution. And that's what design thinking slows down. It says you can't do that. There are these different steps where you first say, what is the problem? And then you stop. And then you basically do what many of you in your science probably do, is find the boundary conditions of your solution. So what in design thinking world, we call it attributes of a solution. So before you get to a solution, you need to know what are the parts, what are the boundary conditions that solution has to meet. So for example, if you're here and you're trying to make a new policy for travel for graduate students, right? You might all get in a room, you'll start brainstorming, and you might come up with something. That's the usual way scientists work. But what design thinking will tell you to do is to say, okay, well, you know that you have a problem. Now let's think about what this travel policy you're thinking about as graduate students needs to have the right components of. So one component might be the department budget is $10,000. We can't spend over. So that's a boundary condition, right? Everybody should be treated fairly. That could be a boundary condition. So those are the things that we came up with in our team. And then we looked at all the different levels of a research and development infrastructure. And we said, let's come up with like a series of plays. So imagine like the Green Bay Packers, they script their first 10 plays in football. We said, let's think about plays that we can give 1 or 2 pagers to people who are research and development infrastructure decision makers, so that they can really go through, and I'll give you an example of this, when they're looking at the role of leadership, forming the planning and execution team. How do they do stakeholder engagement, the construction, implementation, operations of an RDI, research and development infrastructure? How do you hire, retain, promote people, and then communications? So that kind of covers the gamut of all the things that we'd want to do. And we reordered this after the first time we did it to reflect the logical development of how you might build a research and development infrastructure. And our audience here are US government leaders and managers of current or future research and development. I'm not going to give you one example, but in about maybe a year, hopefully we'll publish this, so you'll be able to see what it looks like. So this 1.5 pager, what it does is at the very top, it will have a very short paragraph of what the leaders ought to be doing. So the leaders must set the tone by doing these things. They must publicly declare responsibility for creating an inclusive and diverse workforce. They should create a safe environment for feedback. They should lead by actions and words, have measurable goals. They should ensure a team culture where idea is everybody's responsibility and support idea with adequate resources and funding. When I first presented this a month or so ago, people are like, why are you calling it idea? Why don't you call it DEIA? This is so confusing. And I said, that's exactly the point. DEIA rolls off your tongue. I want you to, pause and go, why are they saying idea? It's because inclusion is hard, right? So we want to really focus on inclusion. And that's why we put I first. So what's a checklist? So if I'm a leader, I will pick this up and I go, oh, have I developed an idea action plan which details the roles and responsibilities of leaders and team members? Have I operationalized the idea plan with milestones and metrics? Have I ensured that these activities are not considered an add-on, et cetera? This is just a selection. There's like 8 to 10 checklist items. And then we also give them questions that they could ask if they can't check a box, right? And the questions are related to the checklist. So has the leader publicly committed to owning idea? What does ownership entail? And then we give them a resource on how they might do that. So we want to train the people to be able to implement this, right? In the ideal world, they will have a checklist and they'll be able to go down and check off all of the things. So is that clear? So this is kind of, what will happen at the end is we are going to develop this. And once all of the 6 plays are finalized, we will test them out because all of your solutions have to be implementable. This is just my belief. They have to be implementable, they have to be measurable, and they have to be sustainable, right? It can't depend on the energy of one person really excited by diversity, equity, inclusion. I have failed many times at creating sustainable structures because I get all excited, I put in my heart and soul, I burn out doing diversity, equity, inclusion work, and that thing just doesn't last, right? So how do you do that? And then it also has to be scalable. And so that's what we're going to try and do. So keep your eyes out for this, open for this. At the end of the day, what do we want to get, right? Our goal is once we implement these policies, further down the line, the science and technology ecosystem of America will reflect the rich diversity of America and be inclusive and lead to equity. That's our ultimate goal. These are just quotable quotes I just wanted to share with you, right? Diversity without inclusion will exacerbate divisions on a team. So diversity is a necessary but not sufficient step. Diversity is easy, but inclusion and equity are hard. So they take a lot more work. Okay, let me give you a couple more examples of how we make policy in the White House. The White House doesn't have the control of the budget. They publish a budget, but really the purse is controlled by the Congress, right? So the real power lies on the Hill, and the real power lies with the Office of Management and Budget, which is making the first budget. But the way the government does a lot of the changes is using executive orders. So I put the whole listing of executive orders related to diversity, equity, and inclusion that this administration has issued. When they issue an order, the agencies have to act. Agencies are named in an executive order saying these agencies must respond. And then agencies kind of work, internally to then give something to the Office of Management and Budget. So it's not just a budget office, it's a management office. So they try to manage that. So for example, there are 300 equity plans that have been submitted in response to 13985. And I think you have one of my classmates from Grinnell, Tom Asher, I think he works here at Columbia, who's now in charge of receiving some of the plans for, I think, EO 14035, which is diversity, equity, and inclusion in the federal workforce. So it's worthwhile reading those. Another way the White House can make policy changes is by issuing memoranda. So here are some examples of memoranda, and I just want to point out memoranda that I often used to do my work on diversity, equity, and inclusion at the White House. So Section 7C says that membership of scientific and technological advisory committees, and as appropriate and consistent with law, ensures that members and future nominees reflect the diversity of America in terms of gender, race, ethnicity, geography, other characteristics, represent a variety of backgrounds, areas of expertise, and experiences. So when somebody would come to me and say, we're appointing these people, like they tried to do for the AAAC, we're like, thank you, we do not accept your recommendation. either we recommend somebody else to be consistent with this memo or ask them to be consistent with this memo. So that's another way the government can influence change and make policies by issuing memoranda. So is that clear? How the White House works? What time is it? I just want to do a time check because I don't want to run out of time here.
You have 20 minutes.
Oh, I only have 20 minutes.
No questions.
Okay, so I'm going to skip this next set or go through it really quickly. So ask me questions later. I'll just say one of the most amazing thing happened during Jim Bridenstine, who was our administrator during the Trump administration, because we adopted the core value of inclusion at NASA. And we also have a strategy that says diversity of thought and backgrounds leads to mission excellence. We established an anti-racism action group that I was a co-chair for. Again, we used design thinking, and we came up with over 200 ideas within the directorate using an incubator workshop. But then we said we shouldn't just think about words. We need actions that are implementable, measurable, sustainable, and things that we can learn from. So here are 8 actions that we implemented. All supervisors must have performance plans, so their bonus is tied to this. We tried to do short-term virtual rotation, so it's not just people getting tapped on their shoulder for leadership tasks. We are working on building long-term engagement with historically excluded groups. By the way, that's the term we prefer as opposed to marginalized or underrepresented or underserved. Historically excluded groups are what really captures sort of what we're trying to do. And we put historical in parentheses because people are still being excluded. We're doing quarterly climate surveys. That's been very helpful to show whether we're making progress. We are starting to collect and publicize aggregate data of people who get awards, and they're terrible. In this next slide, you will see the numbers as they come up. You know, they're less than 1% of African Americans, Native Americans, Latinos who are applying or getting money from NASA. So we have a huge room of improvement here. I wrote this code of conduct many years ago, but now it's adopted across all of Science Mission Directorate, which has been fantastic. We have now set a goal for every division to increase their panel diversity and adopt the code of conduct and an inclusive environment, because we think that people from historically excluded groups can participate in the NASA ecosystem best if we can involve them in the process of how we judge and select proposals. So it's like all of you serving on a time allocation committee. It's one of the best experiences for you to see how to write better proposals. That's what we're trying to do here. And then we're also doing monthly conversations. So the last one we had was on microaggressions. Okay, so that's, we're doing a whole bunch of other things. I'll skip the slide for now. And I just want to go to, I'll skip this one too. I'll come back to it in Q&A. I just want to leave you with some really important remarks on diversity, equity, inclusion. All my 30 years of doing this can boil down to 2 mantras. You can't be what you can't see, and you don't know what you don't know, right? So let's take, for example, Sally Ride going into space. How many women have I seen? Hundreds, thousands, who say, I became a scientist or an engineer because I saw Sally Ride go into space, because I knew I could do it. Yao Ming comes into the NBA, flood of international players, right? Tiger Woods becomes, so I'm using like, you know, Alondra would get mad at me because I was using sports analogies and they're like, they're gendered. Vanessa Williams and Serena Williams, you know, play tennis. How many Black girls start playing tennis because of that? So when NASA shows a picture and says, we only hire the best, and that picture looks completely homogeneous and people from only one background or one race, that sends a subtle message that you are not the best. So we're really trying to work on that. When we show pictures like that, we want to applaud our teams, but we want to say we could do better. So we try to marry that message, and we're trying to change that. If you all do this work, I think it's really, really important to have your leadership acknowledge that there's a problem, say that they're personally responsible, and pledge to take actions. They have to do this in a public forum. And you have to say, put in their speeches, they have to say, hold me accountable. So first time I did this for my boss, Paul Hertz, who might be online. I think he looked really uncomfortable reading it. But as he became more and more comfortable with it, he was one of our biggest champions, right? Because I, as a brown person, didn't have to be in the room where I wasn't going to be listened to as much anyway. But if Paul could say what I really wanted him to say, that was really, really powerful. So leaders are really, really important to change. I think another important thing I'll tell you is that don't focus on hearts and minds. people always think about like, oh, if I could just convince you, this is a sound argument. Like, don't you see the equity? Don't do that. Just focus on changing actions and behaviors, and hearts and minds will follow. So when you're doing diversity, equity, inclusion work, that's what I would recommend that you do. All right, last few minutes. By the way, I should show you. I was like, oh, I wonder who they invited. I think I'm the only person of color you invited, so just make a point here. You know, that's something you all can affect. You are doing the invitations. You will have to work harder. Okay, that's just a subtle jab to you all. Okay, my quick career path, and I'll try to be fast. I went to Iowa. I grew up in India, went to Iowa, went to Minnesota, almost dropped out. You've seen this career path. But where it began was really in India, right? I grew up in India till I was 14, just had a small family, and I loved my life. We did not have constant water, much less constant, electricity. We didn't have a television, car, refrigerator, and grew up relatively poor. I remember renting a bike was a luxury, being able to go around in the compound with my friends, right? What made up my world were these very, very simple things. And America seemed like a complete dream for me. My uncle and aunt gave me a book on Voyager that really got me excited. And really, the thing that really got me excited was when television, we only had one channel growing up in India called Doordarshan, but the first 2 American shows that came to India were Different Strokes, set in New York City, and Star Trek. And we didn't have a TV. So every Sunday morning, I'm running around the society building saying, hey, somebody, can I watch TV in your place? So I was hooked. I really wanted to be an astronomer. I loved my school growing up. I went to a small Christian school, and I learned these lessons of discipline, service, friendship, gratitude, and respect for teachers, which are so critical that 25 years later, we all got together and you could track each of those core values being part of everybody's life. So I really enjoyed meeting all my friends, and thanks to Facebook. But the most important lesson when I reflect back on this, that I belonged when I was in India, and I thrived when I belonged. And so my message to all of you in your groups, when you become academics or you go into other careers, is as leaders, you need to work on developing environments where everybody feels like they belong, that they can bring, their people always say they want to bring their full self, maybe not their full self, but they need to be able to be their best when they come to the workplace, right? So, and you all have power to do this. So you should think actively about this. If I look at, where I really thrived, those are indicated by green check marks. And the things that are, that will show up in red here are the places, whoops, I went by too quickly. I gotta go back. Okay. Sorry. The little lag is killing me here. Okay. So University of Minnesota, I encountered an incredibly racist, sexist department. I almost dropped out. It was so bad that the students filed an EOC complaint against the department. I went down in Thanksgiving to my faculty members and I said, I'm not good enough to be a scientist. Now you have to remember, this is 3 or 4 years after we came to America. My parents came in their 40s. They gave up everything for me and my sister. And here I was just 3 years later saying, I quit, right? Like, it was incredibly painful. And it was because for the first time, the environment was really impacting me. And I didn't want to be there. I stopped going to classes. I got my first D in my life. This is the best advice my faculty gave me from Grinnell. They said, you should quit physics, not because you don't think you can do it, because we know we've prepared you well, but because you don't like it anymore. And so I went back and I said, no, I love physics. So I started taking a lot of actions, and that launched me on this parallel career path in diversity, equity, and inclusion. But I'll come back to that in a second. Other places where I've been, uncomfortable really was in Charlottesville, where I feel like something bad happened to me or to Faye or Aaron like every week. And I would complain about this and people would go, what are you talking about? Charlottesville's great. And then I'm kind of glad, if that's the right word, that the right to life, the right to whatever, rally, Unite the Right rally happened. I'm like, this is what I was telling you guys about. But that's a bad rap for Charlottesville. It is a wonderful place with lots of wonderful people, but I really wasn't comfortable there. And I just wanted to get out. Same thing happened at the White House, right? And the same thing's I feel that now at NASA, where I feel like, oh, I don't know if I belong, right? So as soon as I feel that, I'm like, time for me to leave. Because I know I'm not going to be my best self, right? So I can either try to change it, or I can take a real look and go, well, is it really going to change? Well, probably not. So maybe time to move on. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so came to America. This is the MIA song, which you guys can all read the story about this great song. I think if I play it, you guys know this song. Anyway, trying to lock it now. Okay, so that she wrote that because she was protesting the immigration policy in the U.S. So you should read about it. But I came to New York, and I need to go to the next slide here. Whoops, too far. I was called a brown noser. I'm like, what, do I have a brown nose? I had no idea what that was. In the Midwest, I lived in Iowa my first year with my uncle and aunt, because our family was really split apart, right? We came for a better life as a family. We had no money. My dad couldn't find a job. He moved to New York. My sister moved back to India. I lived with an uncle and aunt in Cedar Falls, Iowa for my 10th grade. Then eventually my parents moved to Edison, New Jersey. We lived in if you guys have ever been to Edison, you can go to the Hilltop Trafalgar apartments. They are terrible. That's where all the immigrants go, right? I could tell you so many stories about that. But there were times when I wouldn't take the bus because it was too painful. I just walked to school because there were all these Indians coming into Edison. Our school went from having really no Indians to having 88 Patels by the time I graduated. We used to call it John Patel Stevens High School for JP Stevens, right? So that xenophobia was really there. In fact, you probably don't remember this, but there was a pipe fitters gang in Union, New Jersey, who killed a woman, who was wearing a bindi. So going to Grinnell was great because it was a time where I knew I would be somewhere for four years. Really liberal arts education. I worked hard, I played hard, never thought about grades at all. There were two transformative experiences for me. One was a time in my sophomore year when there were all these graffiti that was set aside. And Keisho Scott, this African-American studies professor, held a workshop for students of color. And first she starts out the workshop, moving everybody to one side and calling out tall people and short people and brown-haired people and blonde people. And she just said, look, we classify people because that's the shortcut that allows us to deal with the world. But then she did an exercise, which to this day stays with me. She got each different group, Puerto Ricans and Blacks and Indians in front of the whole 75 people who had assembled, and had the audience shout out every stereotype, caricature that they had heard about the group. Like, we're all just bawling, right? Like, I remember this woman who I didn't know standing next to me, just squeezing my hand. Kalpana Devraj, now I know her. But, and her point was, she said, there is so much pain that you live in that you don't even know until I just brought this up. So the last thing I want you as people of color is to do this to each other, right? And it was such a powerful message for me to really think about intersectionality before that was even a word, about the fact that we all live in a world that is oppressive for many of us who are not white. And so that was really, really powerful. And then my senior year, my classmate Tammy Zowicki was murdered. And that just really shook me because I'm like, somebody who's 21 was kidnapped and killed and stabbed. So there's a new podcast about her case that's out right now called Paper Ghosts. But yeah, so that still united my class quite a bit. I never left campus until they kicked us out. And my parents never visited the college till the day I graduated because we just didn't have any money. So, but it was a great place. And I really, really appreciated my time there. Went to Minnesota, like I said to you, encountered this toxic racist environment, almost dropped out. But when I went back, we filed the EOC complaint. I united with these Carleton students. And I started the Women in Physics series. Got a great talk from Faye Eisenberg-Silov, who said, to succeed in graduate school, in fact, to succeed in life, you must be single-minded, focused, and thick-skinned. And her story is very interesting. She'd applied 3 times to University of Pennsylvania, had better grades than her husband, rejected the first 2 times because they said, you already have a breadwinner in your family. And so eventually, but she never gave up. So that's what she meant. Anyway, we did Dinkytown dinners. We took faculty out. We formed a climate committee amongst the faculty, and I started taking astrophysics. And I was like, I'm out of there. I developed this free agent mentality where I said, if I'm uncomfortable, I know I'll be okay, I'm going to leave. And that often helps me get through really difficult times. So if that's something you can develop, I highly recommend it, is developing a free agent mentality. and to not buy into whatever box you're being put into. Know that you will be okay if you step outside. So then I went to grad school in Maryland. I was accepted by Boston University, rejected by UMass, and waitlisted by Maryland, because by now I had quadrupled my GRE scores, but they were still only 44%. So I was glad Maryland accepted me. I really thrived at University of Maryland. I was determined to be the best student to come out of there. The best lesson I got was from a professor there who said, you should be interested in all science. So I would go to colloquia every single day in any discipline. And that really helped me later when I became more of a policymaker. I also, on the very first day, became a sexual harassment prevention trainer because we were asked to go through the training and they asked for volunteers. And I did hundreds of workshops. And I've done many such workshops since then in our community. And you guys can look up a Nature article called Gray Zone of Ethics that Caitlin Casey and I wrote. And you can try to do that workshop here. So that's what I did and then I realized, oh, I better go to a name brand school. You guys are already at a name brand school. I hadn't been. So I was like, I better get my ticket punched if I want a career as a scientist. I wanted to be a AAAS fellow, but they changed the rules and you needed a postdoc. You needed to have a PhD in hand before you could apply. So I only applied for Caltech, Harvard, and Berkeley. And I said, if that doesn't happen, I'm leaving astronomy because it's just a waste of my time. I went to Caltech. Things I really learned there were really important to find your posse, the people who really are going to support you. And you should ignore everybody else who's out there to tell you you're not good enough, right? Like that's a really, really important thing for you to develop as graduate students. I can go through a long list here, but I'll just say in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion, I founded an environmental justice group. And then I was a violence prevention specialist. So I did a lot of community organizing for the LA Commission on Assaults Against Women. Did a lot of work with DV survivors and sexual assault survivors. That was probably some of the most rewarding things. So as graduate students, I really encourage you to do something outside of like the 9 to 6 that you're doing with work, like have a hobby, make friends elsewhere. That's really critical. I'll come back to you.
Okay.
Let me know, I'll tell you later. While I was at Caltech, I got a lot of faculty offers and I was like, I am not an academic. I just don't like academia. So I kept turning faculty positions, tenure track positions down. By the third one, Nick Scoville was like, I'm not writing you another letter if you're not going to take one of these. And I'm like, yeah, but I just don't really feel it. So before I knew it, I was at Caltech for 9 years. Every time I got a faculty offer, they would make me a counter offer with more money, but never as a faculty member. They're like, you're not good enough to be faculty here, but we don't want you to leave. So eventually I ended up leaving there. I went to NRAO and ALMA in Charlottesville, and then eventually to NASA and EOP. So I love these little cartoons, that are for academia with the ivory tower of books. And I'll just let you guys read that. And then what worried me really was this perilous journey to tenure that I was always worried about. So I really didn't want to do that. But in the end, I ended up being in a tenure track at the National Radio Astronomy Observatory. Kind of had 2 jobs or 3 jobs. So one job was being a scientist, and I ended up going on tenure track only after University of Cape Town made me an offer as endowed researcher. Then the director said, okay, well, we'll put you on tenure track now. And I thought that was important because it allowed me to speak with more authority to make changes when it came to diversity, equity, and inclusion, which I couldn't have done. I was a commissioning and science verification liaison for ALMA. I spent 2.5 years living in Chile. I loved it. It's my favorite time. And I was a Science Without Borders professor for Brazil. I love astronomy, mostly because I get to travel the world. So I was always out. So all these great pictures there. While I was at NRAO, I started 2 programs. One is called the National Astronomy Consortium. It's a partnership with 17 historically Black colleges and universities, 7 primarily white institutions, and 3 centers. My conspirator in arms is Aaron Evans, and Aaron and I, and then Faye, who's on the call, were really kind of the leads to try to get this established. We built it on the posse model, which is a model which really builds on cohorts. These are the students from one of the cohorts, including Buntu on the left, who's my student from South Africa. In just 3 years after we started it, we had 19 students. 2/3 were African-American. Half of them were women. We had 6 African-American go through the program. All of them are getting their PhDs, 1 in atmospheric sciences, the other 5 getting a PhD in astrophysics. When we started, there were only 2 African-American women in PhDs in astrophysics. So I think our little program really changed things. We had 4 African-American men who got their degrees through the program. Diana Powell and Sinclair Manning, both of our students, were only the 2nd and the 3rd Hubble Fellows ever, Black women ever, to get a Hubble Fellowship. Both are getting faculty positions. And then because of my connections with South Africa, we started a very similar program in South Africa to try to build the next generation of scientists and engineers across the African continent, driven by the fact that SKA was coming up. I was at a radio observatory. We thought this was the right thing to do, really supported by our corporate sponsors for National Radio Astronomy Observatory. And so that was a lot of fun. And then working with Faye, we also worked, I was appointed the first director for the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, and we wrote some of the plans for new hiring and recruitment practices and tried to lead cultural change. All right, I'm probably out of time, so I'm gonna just quickly tell you, I'm out of time, right? All right, 3 minutes, okay. I got to meet President Obama, it was awesome, but then there were a lot of shitty things in Charlottesville. So I ended up serving on this committee that laid out the NASA's astrophysics vision for the next 30 to 50 years. I was, oh, I really like policy. I should go to NASA. So I came to NASA headquarters where I can roughly, these are the missions that I have worked on in order. So mostly all long wavelength missions, and did a lot of work in public affairs. I also revamped the Hubble Fellowship, so please don't hate me, but I'm the one who combined them from 3 different fellowships to 1 and redid the review process and reduced the number of fellowships. But it saved us like $6 million, and it saved umpteen amounts of time for all of you because you're not writing 3 applications and faculty are not writing 3 sets of.
Basically reduce the number of fellowships?
We did, but overall your chances of getting the fellowship remained the same. It's complicated. The reason was because people were applying to more than 1 fellowship, right? Okay. So it's the same pool, and you reduce the number of fellowships, because probabilities multiply, right? Your odds of getting the fellowship remain the same.
Like the number of fellowships that you actually give out,
it has gone down for when you counted Hubble plus Sagan plus Einstein, they used to be at 30 something, and we reduced them to 24. So lots of reasons we can talk about. So because there are many reasons for that. One was Hubble Fellows were complaining to me. They're like, I go to faculty searches and every other person's a Hubble Fellow. So what's the point of me applying for a faculty position? And the second reason was that people were doing 3 times as much work. The third reason for that was they had just kind of gotten out of hand. They were no longer kind of prestigious fellowships. And the fourth reason was there were so many other external fellowships like PET 51 that were coming on board. So there were so many named fellowships. So we had to decide what to do with our fellowships. So the other things I do there, I manage a $16 million research and technology fellowship, technology development program. And then I do a bunch of work at the SMD level in diversity, equity, inclusion, also as the chair of the API network. And then earth science, all the earth scientists are waiting like, wait, you said you did work in earth science. For a year and a half, I was in earth science, in applied sciences, where I managed a group of economists we built a microeconomics framework called Valuables to understand societal benefits from Earth observations. We did an analysis of 10 years of early adopters programs. And then I basically worked on 3 SDGs, SDG 11, Sustainable Urban Development, and 14 and 15, Life on Land and Life on Water, trying to connect the research to United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. I went to Abu Dhabi and for SDG 11, came back and I said, hey, NASA, there's all this great data, all these great tools and toolkits, and yet nobody's using them in the world which doesn't have resources. It's not because these really smart people in the world don't know how to use our data, but they are missing the pride of ownership. NASA said, we're not interested. So I said, do you mind if I establish my own nonprofit? So that led to the establishment of the Empowered Earth Alliance. The basic idea is somebody has the need for water. I don't want to build them a well. I don't want to give them water. I don't want to give them tools for water. I don't want to give them a design for a well. I want to work with them to empower them to fix the problem that they're having, which is the scarcity of water. And so with that, our vision and mission for Empowered Earth Alliance is that we want to work with local leaders to give them the information needed. That might be scientific, technical, business, policy, legal, so that we empower them to come up with their own solutions that are sustainable. And now in the second version of this, we're focusing on climate resilience in the Americas. So this is just an open invitation to any of you. If this interests you, talk to me and we can see if it can work together. Talked about my parallel career path in inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility. I love this little slide I made, but just want to leave you with these two thoughts. If you don't remember anything else from this talk, if you just remember these two things and apply them to the work you do to make things more inclusive, diverse, and equitable, I think you'll be okay. All right. Thank you. Almost on 60 minutes. Should I stop?
There is
Gary?
a question, if you are going to be available later.
Yeah, I'm here till, I have an 8 o'clock train.
Okay.
Sorry, folks, I went over.
Anybody have a question?
Yeah, I have a question. I'm wondering, you talked about when you're in the White House, like it's a crazy job when you don't get a problem and then you had to learn about it by noon and that kind of thing. Like, what did that look like? Because it seems like overwhelming, to have to learn like that much in such a short time.
Well, we live in an amazing time though. We've got Google. So I'll give you an example. So last 2 Februarys ago, I'm sitting there. It's really cold. There are not a lot of people in the office. And Costa Samaras, who's the principal assistant deputy director for energy, really long title, comes to me and goes, Kartik, you're from NASA. You must know about space solar. I'm like, I don't know what you're talking about. He's like, can you look into it? So now I'm like the expert on space solar for the energy team at the White House. So I just started that day. First Googling, trying to find every news story. And then once you find people, you try to contact them and you say, hey, can I talk to you for 15 or 20 minutes? Can you tell me what's going on? You set up briefings, and we have both government and private sector companies come in and brief the energy team. So I'm still working on that. I wrote a white paper basically that was, 15 pages long. So it wasn't very short, saying this is where we are. And we continue to refine that. And now that we understand where it is, we're thinking about a way to move the needle so that maybe the United States can hopefully do something about space solar, but we have a lot of resistance. So that's how it happened. Does that help?
Yeah, it does.
So,
yeah. Thanks.
It's like grad school, but just super fast. So I often say like going to the White House was like an alien abduction experiment for me. They replaced all the ways I was thinking and just put a really fast processor chip. So now I am like the most impatient person. If a meeting goes over half an hour, I'm like, all right, I'm bored already. Let's go. Like what the military calls it bluff, bottom line up front. That's what you want. What's the bottom line? Tell me what it is, move on, So you just learn to live with uncertainty. So yeah.
Do you feel like you belong more now, like in the White House doing policy rather than the tenure track in academia, or like was it your passion for diversity and inclusion that made you go that route? Like, or do you miss doing research in astronomy?
I really miss some aspects of astronomy. I think it's mostly the travel and the people. I go to astronomy conferences now, and honestly, I still ask a lot of questions because you realize the field moves so slowly. So it's not hard to keep up. So in fact, I'm on a paper this week. So we published our Cosmos Web review paper. So I still try to stay up with Cosmos. I don't really miss it. I feel like the world is dying and we got 10 years to make real change. And if I, as a scientist, don't do something to save the planet and the people affected by it, then I'll regret it when I die. So that's the big reason for establishing Empower Earth Alliance. And if I can make that my full-time job, I will do that, but I still need a paycheck. So, I enjoy doing astrophysics, but it seems more like a hobby now, as opposed to what really drives me. And I think for all of you, I would just say, don't try to chase success. Chase passion and success will follow. It's hard to believe that because, you still need a paycheck. So then you can keep your passion light lit like I'm doing with my nonprofit. So.
Okay.
There are 2 questions.
What did you do for scientific collections?
Oh, scientific collections, yeah. So they wrote a report called the Blue Report about 10 years ago, and now working on the Green Report. I got I probably got the colors wrong or backwards. It's being led by, again, a small group. So Scott Miller at Smithsonian is leading the effort, along with 2 other people at USDA and somewhere else. the report basically has case studies of how important biodiversity is and has concrete recommendations on what we should do to really make sure that scientific collections are robust, digitized, and publicly available. So those are kind of the main recommendations. It kind of got stuck because when I left the White House, they didn't replace me. And I was doing 17 different things, literally. And so some things got picked up, like Joel Perriot's taken over RDI for me, but nobody's taken over the physical sciences subcommittee. Nobody took over IWG, so the scientific collections IWG. So I feel bad because when things aren't well coordinated at the White House, then these things that have really suffer. And when we changed the structure from the Obama and Trump administration to this new structure, nobody did a proper mapping. And so things kind of fell through the cracks sometimes.
So in your work as part of OSTP for something like advanced manufacturing,
Yeah.
What extent do you work with the legislative bodies on something like the CHIPS Act?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so typically I had a meeting with Arun Seraphin, who was the legislative aide at the time for NDA. And he said, I'm glad you guys are writing this strategy. Can we chat? And then he basically went on to complain about the things that bothered the Hill with manufacturing USA institutes. So then I had to keep that in mind. But if you're in the executive branch, you're not allowed to talk to the legislative branch. So you have these folks in the middle who are called the Leg Affairs folks, and they monitor the conversation. The CHIPS and the Science Act are really driven by the White House, right? But they have to be passed by the legislation. So while the White House wrote the bill, or may have played a big role in playing the bill, the policy is really what influences the legislation to say, okay, this legislation is consistent with the administration policy, and now let's try to pass it. I don't know if you remember Schoolhouse Rock. It's probably before your time. Back in, this I learned about it when I came to America. It's like absorbed everything Americana when I came here. But there's a series of little like 50 songs or something called Schoolhouse Rock. And there's a really famous song in there called I'm Only a Bill that's worth listening to. So if you do a YouTube video, it talks about how a bill becomes law. So yeah, I get, I hope that helps. Are there questions on that?
Is there any question people in Zoom? In the chat there is.
I'll be available. Yep, great. Okay, yeah, no
I
question.
think we can finish here.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.